On a warm afternoon, two elderly ladies sat on the patio, rocking gently in their chairs, sipping tea and lamenting about their grandchildren. "I don't understand it," sighed Margaret. "I send gifts, greeting cards, and even generous checks to my grandkids, yet they barely visit me. It's like I don't exist." Helen, her longtime friend, nodded sympathetically. "Oh, I send checks to my grandchildren, too." She took a slow sip of her tea. "And they visit me all the time." Margaret's eyes widened. "Really? Oh, Helen, you're so lucky to have such grateful grandchildren. Mine just take the money and forget about me." Helen chuckled, shaking her head. "Oh, dear, my grandchildren aren't any more grateful than yours." Margaret frowned. "Then what's your secret? Do you send bigger checks?" Helen grinned mischievously. "No, darling, I just don't sign mine." For his 80th birthday, Harold's friends wanted to give him a gift he'd never forget. He had been a widower for years, and they figured he could use a little excitement in his life. So, after much deliberation and a few drinks, they came up with a plan. They would send a high-class escort to his house that evening. As the night rolled in, Harold, dressed in his usual flannel pajamas, was just about to turn in when the doorbell rang. Puzzled, he shuffled to the door, opened it, and found himself face-to-face with a breathtaking woman in a tight, revealing dress. She leaned in with a sultry smile, her voice smooth as silk. "Hey there, handsome," she purred. "I'm here to give you some lovin'." Harold blinked. He rubbed his chin, deep in thought, his eyes scanning her from head to toe. A long silence stretched between them. Finally, he gave a slow nod and said, I'll take the soup." Two elderly ladies, Susan and Margaret, were out for their usual Sunday drive in Susan's massive old car. The problem? Neither of them could see much over the dashboard. As they approached an intersection, the traffic light turned red, but the car cruised straight through. Margaret furrowed her brow, gripping the seatbelt a little tighter. "Did we just run a red light?" she thought. No, surely Susan knows what she's doing. A few minutes later, they reached another intersection. Once again, the light was red, and once again they sailed right through. Margaret's heart began to race. "That was definitely red, wasn't it?" she murmured to herself. "Either I'm losing my mind or Susan is." Determined to clear her doubts, she focused intently as they neared the next light. It was unmistakably red, yet, just as before, they sped through as if the light didn't exist. That was it. She couldn't hold back anymore. "Susan!" Margaret shrieked. "Do you realize we've just run 3 red lights in a row? We could have been killed!" Susan gasped, eyes wide with shock. "Oh, am I driving?" Many years ago, an old sculptor was finally granted permission to leave the Soviet Union and emigrate to the United States, where his son had been living for years. As he prepared to board his flight, he carried only a small suitcase and a heavy bronze bust of Lenin. At the Moscow airport, a stern Soviet customs officer rummaged through his belongings and stopped when he found the bust. "What is that?" the officer asked, eyeing the statue suspiciously. The old man straightened up, indignation in his voice. "What is that? What is that? Comrade, do not say, 'What is that?' Say, 'Who is that?'" "That is Lenin, the genius who built this workers' paradise." The officer, clearly pleased with the answer, smiled and waved him through. Hours later, the sculptor landed at JFK Airport in New York. An American customs officer opened his suitcase and, just like before, found the bust of Lenin. "What is that?" the officer asked. The old man scoffed. "What is that? What is that?" "Officer, do not say, 'What is that?' Say, 'Who is that?' That is Lenin, the bastard. I'll put him on display in my toilet for all the years he prevented an old man from having a good life." The officer chuckled and let him through. Finally, the old man arrived at his family's home in Brooklyn. His grandson eagerly watched as he unpacked his belongings and pulled out the heavy bust. "Who is that, Grandpa?" the boy asked curiously. The old man grinned and patted his grandson's head. "Who is that? Who is that? Don't say, 'Who is that?' Say, 'What is that?' That, my child, is 8 pounds of gold." A young woman walked into a doctor's office with a rather unusual problem. She nervously said, "Doctor, a mobile has slipped into my machine and it's on vibration mode." The doctor, keeping his composure, calmly replied, "All right, just lie down and lift your leg. I'll get it out for you." To his surprise, the woman smirked and said, "Oh no, don't take it out. Just charge the battery." Two lifelong friends grew up together, but after college, life took them in different directions. One moved to New York, the other to Washington. Still, they made a pact. Every 10 years, they would meet in Florida for a round of golf and a long overdue catch-up. It's 32. After finishing their first reunion game, they debated where to go for lunch. "Where do you want to eat?" one asked. "Hooters." "Hooters? Why Hooters? Come on, man, the waitresses, big boobs, tight shorts, gorgeous legs. Good point. Let's go." Age 42. A decade later, after another round of golf, the same question arose. "Where to for lunch?" "Hooters." "Again? Why?" "Cold beer, big screen TVs, and side bets on the games. Sounds good to me." Age 52. Another 10 years passed, another game played. "So where are we eating?" "Hooters." "Why this time?" "The food is decent, and there's plenty of parking." "Fair enough." Age 62. By now, their golf swings were a little stiffer, but their routine remained the same. "Where to?" "Hooters." "Why?" "Wings are half price, and the food isn't too spicy." "Good thinking." age 72. With a few more aches and pains, they still kept their tradition alive. Where should we go? Hooters. Why? 6 handicap parking spaces right by the door, plus a senior discount. Perfect choice. Age 82. By now, memory wasn't what it used to be, but they stuck to their plan. Where do you want to eat? Hooters. Why? Because we've never been there before. Sounds interesting. Let's give it a try. When I was about 7 years old, my father took me to the funeral of a coworker, a man I had never met. Not really understanding what was happening, I stood quietly in a corner, waiting for time to pass. Suddenly, a bitter-looking man approached me. His face was worn, his eyes distant. He bent down slightly, looking me straight in the eye, and said in a low, solemn voice, "Enjoy life, kid. Enjoy it, because time flies. Look at me now. I didn't enjoy it." Then, without another word, he gently ran his hand over my head and walked away. A little later, my father took me to the casket to pay our final respects. As I peered inside, my breath caught in my throat. My stomach twisted in terror. Lying there, lifeless in the coffin, was the same man who had just spoken to me. My body went cold. My hands trembled. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. That night, I barely slept. For years, I suffered from terrible nightmares, waking up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, convinced that ghosts were real. Psychologists tried to help me, but the fear lingered well into my adolescence. I never truly recovered. Then, one day as an adult, I learned something that changed everything. That bastard had a twin. 3 elderly friends were sitting on a park bench, discussing the woes of aging, specifically their failing memories. The first man sighed and said, "Just this morning, I was standing at the top of the stairs completely blanking on whether I had just walked up or was about to go down." The second man nodded in sympathy. "That's nothing. Last night, I sat on the edge of my bed, and for the life of me, I couldn't remember if I was about to go to sleep or if I had just woken up." The third man chuckled and shook his head. "You guys are losing it. My memory is as sharp as ever, knock on wood." With that, he confidently rapped his knuckles on the wooden bench. Suddenly, he looked up, startled, and called out, "Who's there?" A young boy returned home after running an errand for his quarantined grandfather. Proudly, he handed over the groceries and said, "Grandpa, I got everything on your list. The total came to $47.22. Here's your change." Grandpa took the money, shook his head, and let out a deep sigh. "My goodness, the world is expensive nowadays. When I was your age, I could walk into a shop with just 5 cents and walk out with 5 pounds of potatoes, 3 loaves of bread, 2 pounds of beef, a jug of milk, a tin of tobacco for my dad, and a handful of my favorite candies." He leaned back, reminiscing for a moment before shaking his head again. "Can't do that today, though. No siree, Bob." Curious, the boy asked, "Why not, Grandpa?" Grandpa leaned in, lowered his voice, and muttered, "Too many bloody cameras." A lonely widow, now in her 70s, decided it was time to find love again. She placed an ad in the local newspaper. "Husband wanted. Must be in my age group, 70s. Must not beat me, must not run around on me, and must still be good in bed. All applicants, please apply in person." The next day, the doorbell rang. When she opened the door, she was taken aback. Sitting before her in a wheelchair was an elderly gentleman with a full head of silver hair, but he had no arms and no legs. Staring at him, she crossed her arms and said, "You're not seriously applying, are you? Just look at you. You don't even have legs." The old man smiled warmly. "That's true, which means I can never run around on you." She raised an eyebrow. "You don't have arms either." His smile widened. "Exactly. I could never lay a hand on you." The widow tilted her head, still skeptical. "All right. But one last thing. Are you still good in bed?" The old man leaned back in his wheelchair, grinned from ear to ear, and said, "Rang the doorbell, didn't I?" Bell. A small-town preacher stood before his congregation one Sunday morning with an important request. His wife was expecting a baby, and he humbly asked the church for a raise. After much discussion, the congregation agreed on a new policy. Whenever the preacher's family grew, so would his paycheck. At first, it seemed like a fair arrangement, but by the time the preacher's household had expanded to 6 children, the church's financial committee grew concerned. Another meeting was called, and the congregation gathered once more, this time to debate just how much more they could afford to pay their ever-growing preacher's family. Voices rose, arguments broke out, and frustration filled the room. Finally, the preacher stood up, raised his hands for silence, and calmly addressed his flock. "My friends, children are a gift from God." The room fell quiet. Then from the back pew, a frail little old lady slowly stood up. Leaning on her cane, she cleared her throat and said in a shaky but firm voice, "Rain is also a gift from God, but when we get too much of it, we wear rubbers." And with that, the entire congregation said, "Amen."